Max, you can't park that there, Deborah's voice cut through the warm air, sharp and demanding, as she stood at the end of the driveway with a clipboard in hand. Her eyes narrowed, arms crossed over her chest. HOA rules. It's in the code. Service animals are not. I shot her a look, standing tall between her and my cousin Nathan's driveway, where Rex, Nathan's service dog, sat calmly in front of his truck. Deborah, you're really going to get on me for this? I've read the code, I know what it says, and nowhere does it say a veteran's service dog can't be on their owner's property, I shot back, keeping my voice level but firm. She smirked, the kind of smug grin that told me she knew something I didn't. Maybe it doesn't say it specifically, but it's still against our rules. Is that so? I raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. Let me guess, you've been so deep in the rulebook you missed that little note on service animals under the ADA? I paused for effect. The next words I spoke were enough to make her take a step back. I've got a DOJ letter confirming Rex's status. Not only that, I've got legal precedents and a stack of court cases that say you're overstepping. And if you want to challenge me, you're about to find out how deep the legal rabbit hole goes. Deborah blinked, clearly caught off guard by my response. I'm Max Bennett, and I don't take lightly to being pushed around by people who think they can bully others with a set of rules they barely understand. I didn't say it with anger. Just a quiet certainty that she'd regret this confrontation. This place, this house, has been in my family for generations. My grandfather worked these lands, my father maintained them, and now I'm here to protect it. So, before you start your little power trip, just know this. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is Rex. Where you watching from? Hit subscribe to follow my fight to keep this land and this legacy safe from people like Deborah. Trust me, it's about to get interesting. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could get a word out, I took a step back, letting the silence hang between us. My hand instinctively went to the chain around my neck, the old family crest still hanging from it like it had since I was a kid, my grandfather's legacy. The house was more than just property, it was my heritage. I could feel Deborah's eyes on me, and as much as she probably wanted to challenge me again, she couldn't, not here, not with everything I had backing me. The quiet tension between us was thick, but it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Max Bennett. That was who I was. A man who'd been raised to protect what was his, no matter who tried to take it. And if this HOA thought they could get away with trampling on my family's legacy, they were sorely mistaken. Deborah's gaze lingered on me for a moment longer, her lips pressed tightly together as if she was weighing her next move. The silence stretched, thick with the tension between us. Her hand tightened around the clipboard, and I could see her mind working, trying to think of something, anything, to turn this situation in her favor. Max, you can't just make your own rules, she finally said, her voice dripping with false politeness. You're violating HOA code. You don't get to pick and choose what you follow. If you want to live here, you follow the rules like everyone else. I shook my head, stepping closer, careful to keep the tone even but firm. Deborah, you're the one who's bending the rules now. You're using your little HOA handbook to go after a disabled veteran. What's next? Will you make the next person with a service dog prove they belong here too? Her eyes narrowed as she raised her chin, trying to maintain her control over the situation. I don't know what you're implying, Max, but I'm implying that this is about more than just a parking spot, I interrupted, keeping my voice steady. You're trying to force Nathan and Rex out. You know it and I know it. This isn't about a minor infraction. It's about you exercising your power, and it's not going to work. She hesitated, eyes flashing with frustration before turning to the clipboard once again, scribbling something that felt like an empty threat. I could tell she was stalling, looking for a way to backpedal without losing face. But I wasn't giving her that chance. I'll be watching, Deborah. You're messing with the wrong person, I added. My voice dropped, not in anger, but in quiet determination. I've been around long enough to know when someone's abusing their position. You better hope you're ready for the fallout. Her eyes flickered with something that resembled fear for a split second. Then, just like that, the mask was back on, her expression neutral. Fine, keep talking, Max, but don't say I didn't warn you, she said, before turning on her heel and walking briskly toward her car. I stood there, watching her leave, the weight of what had just transpired settling heavily on my shoulders. Nathan, who'd been standing silently beside me, let out a long, frustrated sigh. You really think she'll back off? He asked, glancing over at me. I shook my head slowly. No, but that's just the first round. She's not done yet. Nathan nodded, his hand resting gently on Rex's head. This place used to be full of people who cared about the community, not just their little rules. I knew what he meant. The neighborhood had changed over the years. There was a time when people were more willing to lend a hand, more focused on helping each other than enforcing petty restrictions. But Deborah and the HOA weren't interested in the community anymore. They were interested in control. The truth was, I hadn't expected it to get personal. I was just here to visit Nathan, to help out when I could. But now I felt like I had no choice but to dig in and protect what was mine, what was our family's. I glanced back at the house behind me, the one I grew up in, where my grandfather's tools still hung in the shed and my father's old woodwork bench stood in the garage. This wasn't just property to me. It was history. It was a legacy. My grandfather had built this place from the ground up, and my father had worked the land before handing it down to me. The house had seen its share of struggles, but it had always been home. I wasn't about to let Deborah or anyone else take that away. "Do me a favor, Nathan," I said, turning to him. "I'm going to need you to stay sharp. They won't stop at this. They'll try again." Nathan met my eyes, and for the first time today there was a hint of a smile. "You think I've been sitting here all this time doing nothing? I've got your back. You just point the way." His words were a reminder of why I was fighting in the first place, for my family, for this land, for Nathan, who had given so much in the service of this country and deserved a place to call home without being harassed. As I watched Deborah's car drive off down the street, I could feel my pulse quickening, but it wasn't fear, it was resolve. This wasn't just about Rex or Nathan's rights, it was about setting a precedent. If I didn't stand up now, if I didn't fight back, then what was next? Where would it end? I had no illusions about what I was up against. The HOA held power over this community, but I had something they didn't, the truth on my side, and the law. "Let's see how far they'll go," I muttered to myself as I turned back to Nathan. "I'm not backing down." The evening was quieter than usual when I headed back inside. Nathan had retired to his room, and Rex curled up at the foot of the bed. The silence of the house felt heavier now, like the calm before a storm. I could still feel the tension from my confrontation with Deborah. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. As I sat in the living room, flipping through the news on my phone, I heard a soft knock at the door. I stood up and opened it, expecting another visit from the HOA or maybe a neighbor with more complaints. Instead, I was greeted by Lily. Lily. She used to be one of my closest friends. We grew up together in this neighborhood, and it wasn't until the HOA started pushing its weight around that things changed between us. She'd joined the board not long ago, and while I respected her intelligence and work ethic, there was always something about her position that didn't sit right with me. "Hey, Max," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Her eyes avoided mine for a moment, and I could see that familiar discomfort in her posture. She stood on the porch, half in and half out, like she was deciding whether to step inside or walk away. "What's up, Lily?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. It was hard to read her these days. I just wanted to talk," she said, her eyes darting over her shoulder toward her house, as though making sure no one was watching. It wasn't like Lily to be nervous, so my guard went up immediately. Can we go inside? It's about what happened earlier." I motioned for her to come in, stepping aside to let her through. She hesitated again before walking in, eyes scanning the familiar space as though she hadn't seen it in years. "Sit down. You want a drink?" I asked, trying to keep things casual. She shook her head, sitting on the edge of the couch, her fingers tracing patterns on the armrest. She didn't look at me directly, but I could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. It was a stark contrast to the confident, sharp Lily I'd known. This version of her seemed broken. "Max, I need to be honest with you," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't agree with everything that's happening with the HOA. I haven't for a while now." She paused, her eyes flicking up to meet mine for the first time. "But I'm stuck." "Stuck?" I asked, my frustration starting to build. "You're on their board, Lily. You have the power to do something about this." Her face tightened. "I know, believe me, I know. But you don't understand what it's like. Deborah, she's been using the HOA as her personal tool. She's pushing everyone around, twisting arms, threatening people with fines, all to get her way." So why not quit? I demanded, leaning forward. Why not stand up to her? If you see what she's doing, why not take action? Lily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands twisting in her lap. It's not that simple. Deborah has dirt on everyone. If I leave the board, if I go against her, I risk losing everything. My job, my standing in this community, my future. She stopped herself, swallowing hard. It's not just about what's right anymore. It's about survival. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The Lily I knew, the one who always spoke up for what was right, was gone, replaced by someone who was willing to stay silent to protect her own interests. This isn't just about Deborah, though, I said, my voice calm but firm. This is about us, our family, the people who've been here for generations. And you're telling me you can't even stand up for the truth? Her eyes welled up, but she quickly blinked them away. I'm sorry, Max. I'm so sorry. I don't know what to do. I stared at her for a long moment, feeling a mix of pity and anger. I wanted to help her, I really did, but how could I when she was too afraid to help herself? Lily, you're not alone in this, I said, my voice quieter now. You don't have to do this alone. You can make a difference. You just have to find the courage to do it. She looked at me for a moment, the tension in her face easing just slightly. I'll think about it, she said softly. Think fast, I shot back. Deborah's not going to wait forever. With that, Lily stood up, gave me a brief nod and left without another word. I watched her walk back to her house, feeling the weight of her decision hanging in the air. As I closed the door behind me, I knew one thing for certain. This fight was only going to get messier, but I wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Where are you watching from? Make sure you subscribe to see how this all plays out. This fight's not over by a long shot. I spent the rest of the evening making calls. Lawyers, veterans organizations, even some old contacts I hadn't talked to in years. It wasn't just about standing up to the HOA anymore. It was about protecting Nathan, protecting what was ours, and making sure Deborah didn't get away with using her power to push people around. I knew she wouldn't back down easily. The HOA board had long been a place where people who wanted to control things could do just that, and Deborah was the worst of them. But I wasn't going to let her push Nathan around. Not now. Not after everything he'd been through. The phone rang again, cutting through the quiet of the house. This time it was Nathan's voice, a bit shaken. Max, I need you to come over here, he said, his tone urgent. Something's happened. I didn't even ask. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door. By the time I reached Nathan's house, my mind was racing. I had no idea what could have happened, but something in his voice told me it was bad. As I walked up the front steps, I heard raised voices from inside. Deborah, of course. I stepped inside to see Nathan standing in the hallway, Rex beside him, and Deborah talking to a police officer. The cop looked uncomfortable, like he was just doing his job but didn't really want to be here. Deborah, however, had a smug look on her face. Is there a problem here? I asked, keeping my voice calm but firm. Deborah turned to me, her eyes flashing with a mix of triumph and irritation. Oh, Max, she said with that sugary sweet tone of hers. I was just explaining to Officer Grant here that this dog, she pointed to Rex, is an unregistered service animal, and that's a violation of HOA policy. I had to call the police, of course. I was concerned for the safety of the neighborhood. The cop shifted awkwardly. Ma'am, we've been over this. I'm just here to make sure everything's okay. There's no violation of the law as far as I can see. I could feel my blood begin to boil, but I kept my expression neutral. So, Deborah, I said, my voice cool, you've decided to waste taxpayer money by calling the police on a registered service animal? That's what we're doing now? She gave me a false, tight-lipped smile. I'm just making sure we follow the rules, Max. You should try it sometime. I looked over at Nathan. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he stood by Rex. He'd been through enough in his life, and now Deborah was trying to drag him through the mud for something he couldn't control. I stepped forward, addressing the officer directly. Officer, you need to tell her that this isn't a situation for police involvement. Nathan's dog is registered with the Department of Justice. He's protected by federal law. Deborah's making this whole thing up. Officer Grant nodded, clearly uncomfortable. Ma'am, I'm afraid you can't just call the police every time someone's in violation of HOA policy. That's not something we handle. Deborah's face flushed, but she didn't back down. I'm just trying to make sure this community is safe. We can't have people taking advantage of loopholes. I could see where this was going. Deborah wasn't going to let it go, not without making a scene. I had to act fast. and I had to do it in a way that would make her look like the fool. "Deborah, you need to stop," I said, my voice hardening. "You've crossed the line here. You're not the law. You're not the police. You're just a woman with a clipboard trying to make things harder for people who've already had enough." I turned to Officer Grant, then back to Deborah. "And I'll be filing a complaint with the department for wasting their time on something like this. If you want to keep going down this road, I'll make sure everyone knows you're abusing your position." Deborah's jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought she might explode, but instead she just smiled thinly, her eyes glinting with something darker. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice low and dangerous. With a final glance at Nathan and Rex, I turned and walked out the door. I could hear Deborah muttering something behind me, but I didn't care. As I stepped back into the cool night air, I knew this wasn't over. It had just escalated, and now I had everything I needed to go after her. Deborah had made her move. Now it was my turn. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and research. Deborah's little stunt with the 911 call had rattled me more than I cared to admit, but it also sparked something in me. I wasn't about to let her walk all over Nathan, or any of us. She'd just made the fight personal, and now I was going to make sure she couldn't hide behind her power any longer. Nathan didn't say much about it, but I could tell he was troubled. Every time I glanced at him, I saw the faint tremor in his hands or the faraway look in his eyes. It wasn't just the stress of the HOA, it was the constant battle he fought in his own mind. He deserved better than this. Hell, we all did. I had to find something solid, something that would expose Deborah for the manipulative, power-hungry person she was. If I could catch her in the act of abusing her position, it would be game over. But where to start? I sat at my desk, sifting through old files that had been gathering dust in the attic. The house was full of things like that. Old records, boxes of papers, and mementos that had been left behind by my grandfather. Among the clutter, I knew there had to be something that would give me the edge. Nathan had mentioned before that he'd kept a lot of paperwork about his service dog, Rex. Official documents, registration papers, everything the law required. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up to the attic. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of old wood filled my nostrils. This attic had always been my grandfather's domain. He'd spent countless hours up here, sorting through tools, maps, and paperwork. The memories of him, his hands weathered from years of hard work, his voice steady and full of wisdom, flooded back as I navigated the cramped space. I pulled open a cardboard box near the far end of the room and began to sift through its contents. There were old journals, faded photographs, and yellowed letters, but no sign of anything useful. My frustration mounted, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Then, a flash of silver caught my eye. A small, tarnished metal file box sat in the corner, almost hidden beneath a stack of old magazines. I dragged it out, setting it down on the wooden floor with a soft thud. My heart skipped a beat. This was it. I clicked open the latch and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, I found a stack of neatly arranged papers, some marked with official stamps. There it was. Rex's registration papers, the DOJ certification, and even a few old communication logs from when Nathan had first applied for Rex's service dog status. But something else caught my eye. Buried beneath the papers was a handwritten letter. The faint, spidery handwriting made my stomach tighten as I pulled it out. It wasn't Nathan's handwriting. It was Deborah's. The letter, dated months ago, was addressed to someone in the HOA. The contents were vague at first glance, but one sentence stood out like a sore thumb. If Max Bennett continues to cause problems, I'll have no choice but to escalate matters further. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Deborah had been planning this all along. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was targeting us, targeting Nathan. This wasn't about codes or bylaws, it was personal. I stared at the letter for a long moment, the weight of it settling over me like a thick fog. My fingers trembled as I reread the words, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. This was the smoking gun I needed. Deborah had crossed a line, and now I had proof. With the letter in my hand, I made my way back downstairs, my mind racing. The pieces were falling into place. Deborah had been using her position to target Nathan and by extension our family. I had to act quickly. This wasn't just about confronting her anymore, it was about dismantling everything she'd built. I found Nathan in the kitchen, his back to me as he poured a cup of coffee. When he turned around and saw the expression on my face, his eyes widened. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. I placed the letter on the table, sliding it toward him. "This changes everything." Nathan glanced at it, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at me, a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, anger, maybe even relief. "This is it, isn't it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah," I said, my hand gripping the edge of the table. "It's time to end this." The weight of the letter hung over me, heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of evidence that could turn the tide in our favor, but only if I used it right. If Deborah thought she could intimidate Nathan and me into submission, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. I sat across from Nathan in the kitchen, the letter between us, both of us processing the revelation. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the paper with a sense of disbelief. "Max, this isn't just a threat, it's a confession. She's been planning this," Nathan said, his voice tight. I nodded, my mind already racing ahead. "It's not just that. This proves she's been using the HOA to go after us. If she's done it to us, she's done it to others. She's weaponizing her position." The thought of it made my blood run cold. Deborah wasn't just enforcing some petty rules, she was manipulating the system for personal gain. That kind of power had to be stopped, and I was the one to do it. "We need to make sure this doesn't end here," I muttered to myself, already thinking of the next steps. "We need more than just this letter." Nathan looked up from the letter, his face hardening. "What are you thinking?" "Evidence, we need to connect the dots," I said, my voice steady. "I'm going to dig into the HOA's finances, their records, anything I can find. She's been pulling strings, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows." Nathan leaned back in his chair, looking both concerned and determined. "You know she's not going to let this go, right? She's not the type to back down without a fight." "I know," I replied, my voice low. "But this time, I've got something she can erase. It's time to hit her where it hurts." As soon as Nathan left the room, I grabbed my phone and began calling around. I started with the lawyer, Catherine, the one I'd been consulting for legal advice. If we were going to make this stick, I needed her to back me up. I needed her to help me prepare for the next step. The phone rang, and Catherine picked up after a few rings. "Max, what's going on?" Her voice was calm, but with an edge that told me she was ready to get to work. "I've got something," I said, without wasting time. "Deborah's been targeting Nathan, using the HOA to push him out. I have a letter. She's been plotting this from the beginning. We need to act, and we need to do it fast." I could hear the pause on the other end of the line as Catherine absorbed what I was saying. "A letter? A threat?" "Yeah. It's from her to someone on the HOA board. She's been trying to get us kicked out. She's been using her position to manipulate things, and this letter is the proof we need." And I could feel her calculating, strategizing. "All right, send it to me. I'll start looking into her financials, any irregularities in the HOA's records. If she's abusing her power, we'll find it. We'll make sure it sticks." I ended the call, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in days. Catherine was one of the best lawyers I knew, and if anyone could dig into the HOA's dirty laundry, it was her. I knew this battle wasn't going to be won overnight, but with her on our side, we had a chance. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I spent hours researching HOA laws, reading through community records, and pulling any public financial statements I could get my hands on. I wasn't going to leave any stone unturned. If Deborah thought she could play God with people's lives, she was in for a rude awakening. I even reached out to some neighbors who'd been targeted by Deborah in the past. People were afraid to speak out, but they weren't afraid to talk to me. They'd seen Deborah's tactics, how she'd forced fines on families for the smallest of infractions, how she'd harassed residents who didn't fall in line. They were all too willing to share their stories, and I made sure to record every word. By the time I met with Catherine again, I had a mountain of evidence. I laid it all out in front of her. Public records, testimonies, Deborah's letter. The case was building, and it was beginning to feel like I might actually have a shot at taking her down. Catherine looked over the documents, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, there was a fire in her eyes. "Max, this is bigger than I thought. If Deborah's been using the HOA to go after people like this, she's in serious trouble." I nodded, the weight of it all finally sinking in. "We can't let her get away with this. It's not just about Nathan anymore. It's about everyone she's hurt." Catherine smiled, her tone turning confident. We'll make sure she doesn't. It's time for her to face the consequences. I felt a surge of determination. We were getting closer, and this time there was no backing down. Where are you watching from? Don't miss the next step in this battle. Subscribe and stay tuned. This fight is about to reach a whole new level. It was time to make our move. The evidence was stacked high: financial irregularities, testimonies from neighbors, the damning letter from Deborah herself. But now it was about more than just collecting documents. Now we had to act. We had to take everything we'd gathered and use it in a way that would hit Deborah where it hurt: her reputation, her position, and her power. I sat at my desk, staring at the pile of paperwork before me, when the phone rang. It was Catherine. Max, she said, her voice tight, I've gone through everything you sent me. We've got a solid case here, but we need to be smart about this. If we move too fast, Deborah might bury us in legal technicalities. We need a plan that hits her from multiple angles. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the exhaustion in my bones, but there was no time for rest. I'm listening. What are you thinking? We need to force her into a corner, Catherine said, her voice taking on that calm, strategic tone I knew so well. I'm working with a couple of people to dig deeper into the HOA's financials. There's more to this than what we've found so far, but I can't do it alone. We need more eyes on this. I thought for a moment, nodding as I listened. I can't trust most of the neighbors. They're scared of her. But what about Lily? She's still on the board, right? Catherine hesitated. She's conflicted. She's scared. But you're right. She's in a position to help us. If she comes forward, it'll be a game changer. I slammed my fist lightly on the table, the frustration creeping in again. But she's been dodging me. She's not going to just turn on Deborah. Max, you have to give her a reason, Catherine replied. We can't force her to do the right thing, but we can make sure she knows what will happen if Deborah keeps going unchecked. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of the situation settle in. We weren't just fighting for Nathan anymore. This was bigger. It was about standing up against a system that was broken, a system that people like Deborah had used to manipulate the lives of everyone around her. We had the evidence now. It was time to bring it into the light. I'll talk to Lily, I said. I'll make sure she understands what's at stake. The next day, I found myself standing outside Lily's house. The nerves I'd felt the first time we talked weren't gone, but they were tempered by something else now. There was a fire inside me, a determination to make things right, to fight for the people who deserved it. Lily answered the door after a few moments, her face softening slightly when she saw me. I didn't expect you, she said, stepping aside to let me in. Her eyes flickered with guilt, and I could tell she'd been thinking about our last conversation. I need you to listen, Lily, I said, my tone serious. This isn't just about Deborah anymore. It's about all the people she's hurt, and if you don't help us stop her, she's just going to keep doing it. Lily closed the door behind me, the soft click of the latch echoing in the silence. She leaned against the wall, arms folded tightly across her chest. I know, she said, her voice soft. But you don't get it, Max. I can't just walk away from this. Deborah has dirt on everyone on the board. If I go against her, if I speak out, she'll destroy me. I stepped closer, making sure to keep my voice calm. Lily, she's already destroyed a lot of people. Look at Nathan. Look at what she's done to him. To me, she doesn't care about the rules. She's using you and everyone else to get what she wants. If you don't stand up now, you're just as much a part of the problem. She winced at my words, her hands trembling slightly. What if I lose everything? You won't, I said, my voice steady. You'll lose nothing. But if you stay silent, you'll lose yourself. You're better than this, you know it. I could see the internal struggle in her eyes. She wanted to do the right thing, I knew she did, but fear was holding her back. I could see the weight of her position pressing down on her, but I also saw a flicker of resolve. I'll help you, she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. But we do this carefully. I'll gather what I can, but we need to make sure we're ready. If we do this wrong, Deborah will find a way to crush us. I nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. We will. I'll get the legal team ready. We'll hit her where it hurts. Lily stood up straighter, a look of determination now replacing the uncertainty in her eyes. Let's make this right. Lily's decision to help us was a game changer. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we might actually have a chance against Deborah. I wasn't naive enough to think the fight would be easy, but at least now I had someone on the inside who knew how Deborah operated, someone who could help us navigate the complexities of the HOA and expose her for what she truly was. The days that followed were a blur of action. Catherine and I worked tirelessly, digging deeper into the HOA's financials, tracking down legal precedents, and coordinating with Lily to gather the final pieces of the puzzle. The clock was ticking, and I could feel the pressure mounting with every passing hour. I wasn't about to let Deborah get away with this. Not after everything she'd done to Nathan. Not after everything she'd done to this community. We needed to take her down, but we also needed to do it right. The last thing I wanted was for this to backfire and leave us vulnerable. We had one shot at this. Lily had promised to provide us with a key piece of evidence, a series of emails between Deborah and several board members, outlining her plans to target specific residents. But as the days went on, I started to notice something. Lily was becoming more distant. She was still communicating with me, still feeding us information, but there was an unease in her tone that hadn't been there before. I knew what she was feeling. Fear. She was walking a tightrope, caught between doing the right thing and protecting herself. But every time I spoke to her, her resolve seemed to waver. She wasn't backing out, but I could feel her hesitating at the edge. It wasn't until late one evening when I finally got the call I'd been waiting for. "Max, we've got it," Lily said, her voice low and urgent. "The emails. I've got everything you need. It's all in one place. You need to come get it." I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, my mind racing with anticipation. This was it. The moment I'd been preparing for. If we played our cards right, Deborah wouldn't see it coming. I pulled up to Lily's house, parked, and made my way to the door. She let me in quickly, her expression guarded. There was no time to waste. Without a word, she led me to her desk, where a flash drive sat, innocently enough, next to her laptop. "This has everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Deborah's plans, the emails. I've even got some confidential records from the last board meeting. You need to use it wisely, Max. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." I took the flash drive from her hand, my fingers brushing against hers. "You've done more than enough, Lily," I said, my voice soft but sincere. "You've done the right thing. Now we finish it." Her eyes flickered with doubt for a moment, but she nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Just promise me you'll win, okay? For all of us." I squeezed her hand, giving her an assuring look. "We're going to take her down, Lily, I promise." With that, I left her house, my heart pounding in my chest. The drive back to my place was a blur, the world outside fading into the background, as my thoughts focused entirely on the mission ahead. The final pieces of the puzzle were in place. Deborah had no idea what was coming for her. I plugged the flash drive into my computer and opened the files. The emails were damning. Deborah had been systematically planning her attacks, cherry-picking the people she wanted to target and making moves to make their lives hell. She'd used her position to manipulate, threaten, and control. Every move she made was calculated, but it was all out in the open now. There was no turning back. I knew this wouldn't be easy. Deborah was smart, and she had a way of getting out of tight spots, but this time the evidence was irrefutable. She couldn't talk her way out of this. As I sifted through the documents, the weight of what we were about to do settled heavily on my shoulders. This wasn't just about taking down Deborah, it was about making a statement. It was about standing up for the people who had been crushed under her rule. It was about making sure that no one ever had to go through what we had again. I closed the laptop, taking a deep breath as I prepared myself for the next phase. Tomorrow, we were going to confront Deborah. Tomorrow, everything changed. The morning arrived with the kind of tension I hadn't felt in years. I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, gathering evidence, organizing my thoughts, and strategizing the right way to confront Deborah. But as the sun rose and the weight of what was about to unfold hit me, the anxiety was hard to shake. It wasn't just the fight against Deborah. It was what she represented, the kind of unchecked power that had been allowed to fester, quietly suffocating everyone around her. I grabbed the folder with the evidence, the flash drive still tucked inside, and headed out the door. Nathan was already waiting for me in the living room. His face was calm, but I could see the tension in his posture. He'd been quiet, focusing on Rex, who sat at his feet, but I knew he was as ready as I was for this. "This is it, huh?" Nathan said, his voice low but resolute. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep the nerves out of my voice. We've got the upper hand now. She's not going to get away with this." He nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You think she'll give up just like that?" "No," I said, my tone hardening. "But she's going to have no choice but to step down, not after everything we've got on her." The drive to the HOA office was short but felt like an eternity. My mind raced with thoughts of what I'd say, how I'd present the evidence. We weren't just confronting a petty neighbor anymore, we were up against someone who had abused her position for far too long. It wasn't just personal anymore, it was about exposing the truth. When we arrived, I saw the familiar structure of the HOA office looming in front of us. Deborah's kingdom, the walls and windows that held the power to ruin lives, all hidden behind a facade of rules and regulations. Today, that facade was coming down. As we walked through the door, the receptionist greeted us with a forced smile. She knew who I was by now. Word traveled fast in small communities. She didn't say much but directed us to the back office where Deborah would be waiting. I knocked on the door, feeling the adrenaline start to surge. Deborah's voice called out from inside, a bit too sweet for my liking. "Come in." I pushed the door open, and there she was, sitting behind her desk, hands folded, the picture of control. Her smile was as tight as ever, but there was something different about her now. Maybe it was the realization that the game was up. Or maybe it was just the way she tried to maintain her composure despite everything she knew was about to fall apart. "Max," she said, her voice cold but polite, "I see you've decided to pay me a visit. What can I do for you?" I didn't waste any time. I slid the folder across the desk, watching her closely as she glanced at it. The tension in her expression didn't change immediately, but I saw the flicker of recognition. She knew what was inside. "You've been using your position to manipulate the HOA, Deborah," I said, my voice steady. "You've been targeting Nathan and me, pushing us out for your own benefit. And now we have everything on you, your emails, your financial discrepancies, and the threats you've made." Her lips curled into a smile, but it was forced, like she was trying to convince herself of something. "Hicks, you're so dramatic. I've done no such thing. I've only been enforcing the rules." I leaned forward, my gaze unwavering. "You've been breaking the rules. You've been using them to control people, to bully them. And we've got it all documented. Every email, every conversation. You've been playing a dangerous game, and now it's over." Deborah's eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw a crack in her armor. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you can just waltz in here and make me crumble? You're wasting your time. People like me always win in the end." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words settle. "Not this time. You've underestimated us. And now you're going to face the consequences of your actions." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Deborah's confidence was fading, and I could see it in the way her posture stiffened, in the way she struggled to keep her voice calm. "You're going to pay for this, Max," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You think you've got it all figured out, but you don't. You have no idea what you're up against." I smiled, a slow, confident grin. "I think I do. And I think you're out of moves." Deborah opened her mouth, probably to say something else, but the words caught in her throat. Her face flushed, and I could see the frustration building. For the first time in a long time, I could see the real Deborah, the woman who used her position to intimidate and control. And now she was losing that power, piece by piece. I stood up, ready to leave. "We're taking this to the board, and after that I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you've been up to. Your little empire is falling apart, Deborah, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." With that, I turned and walked out, leaving her sitting in her office, the silence of the moment settling in. Where are you watching from? This is just the beginning. Make sure to subscribe, because the fallout is about to hit hard. The days after my confrontation with Deborah were a blur. I'd handed over the evidence to the board, and now all we had to do was wait for the storm to hit. I could feel it in my gut, the calm before the real battle. Deborah was cornered. There was no way out for her, not this time. But that didn't mean she wasn't going to fight dirty. The community meeting was scheduled for the end of the week. It was going to be a public reckoning, a final showdown between Deborah and everyone she had manipulated. I spent those days preparing, gathering documents, printing emails, organizing witness statements. It was time to expose her for the fraud she was, and this time I wasn't going to let her talk her way out of it. Nathan wasn't with me in the lead-up. He was still shaken from everything, and I knew this wasn't easy for him. But the truth was, this wasn't just his fight. This was about everyone who had been harmed by Deborah's overreach. I needed him to know that. I needed him to see that we were doing this not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been too scared to speak out. The meeting was packed. People spilled into the conference room, murmurs filling the air as I walked in with the evidence in hand. I could see the uncertainty in some of the faces, the fear of rocking the boat. But there were also others, people I had talked to in the past few days, people who had witnessed Deborah's power plays firsthand. They weren't silent anymore. They were ready to stand up. I made my way to the front of the room, where the HOA board members were seated. Deborah sat at the head of the table, a confident smile plastered on her face. It was the same smile she had worn when she thought she could control everyone around her, but I knew something she didn't. This time, the game was mine to win. I set the folder down on the table with a quiet thud. Deborah's smile faltered, just for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Max," she said coolly, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I didn't expect you to show up here today. What's all this about?" "I'm here to make sure the truth comes out," I replied, my voice steady. "You've been hiding behind your power for far too long, Deborah, and today we're going to expose every move you've made." I reached for the stack of papers and began to lay them out for everyone to see. Emails, financial documents, records of her illegal actions. Everything was there. I could feel the eyes of the room on me as I spoke, and the tension was palpable. "Deborah," I said, my voice rising now, "you've been manipulating the rules to punish people you didn't like, threatening residents, even making false accusations to drive people out of their homes. This isn't just about petty bylaws. This is about abuse of power." I could see Deborah's hand tighten on the table, her knuckles turning white. But she didn't speak. Instead, she shot a glance at the other board members, trying to gauge how they were reacting. One of them, an older man named Harold, shifted in his seat. "Is this all true, Deborah?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Deborah's mask finally cracked, just a little. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, I spoke again, cutting her off. "You've been trying to intimidate people," I said, my voice unyielding. "You've been using the power of this board to push your personal agenda, and now we have everything. You can't talk your way out of this." The room was silent now. Deborah opened her mouth, but no words came out. I could see the realization hit her. She was cornered. There was no escaping this. "I've seen the emails," I said, holding up a few key pages. "I've seen the records. You've been targeting Nathan, manipulating the HOA rules to get rid of him and anyone else you didn't like. You've been making decisions based on personal vendettas, not community welfare." Deborah's gaze flickered nervously, but she stayed silent. The room was still, everyone waiting for her to respond, but she couldn't. She knew she had been caught, and for the first time, she didn't have the power to make it all disappear. Harold cleared his throat. "Deborah," he said, his voice quieter now, "I think it's time we took a vote." I watched as the board members glanced at each other, each of them processing what had been laid before them. No one was speaking up for Deborah anymore. The weight of the evidence was too much. I stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle in. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment I could take the power back. The moment I could say with certainty that justice had been done. After what felt like an eternity, Harold finally spoke again. "I think it's clear what needs to happen here," he said, his voice firm. "Deborah, you're relieved of your position, effective immediately." Deborah's face twisted in anger, but there was nothing she could do. The room erupted into murmurs, some of approval, others still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. But for me, the victory was sweet. We had won. I turned to Nathan, who was standing quietly in the back. He gave me a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had just accomplished. The fight wasn't over. There would be more battles ahead. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like we'd taken a real step toward making things right. The air was thick with the buzz of disbelief. Deborah, the woman who had ruled this community with an iron fist, now sat in stunned silence, her world crumbling around her. The vote had been swift, the decision unanimous. Deborah was out, her reign of manipulation and fear over, finally dismantled by the very people she had sought to control. The room had erupted into murmurs when Harold spoke those words, words that I hadn't even dared to hope for just weeks ago. "Deborah, you're relieved of your position, effective immediately." I felt a small surge of triumph. This wasn't just about getting her out of the HOA. It was about righting the wrongs she'd done. But even as I stood there, my pulse still racing from the confrontation, a part of me knew that the hardest part wasn't over. This wasn't just a victory for me, for Nathan, or even for the community. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced, who had ever been pushed aside in the name of power. I caught Nathan's eye from across the room. He was standing quietly, his hands clasped in front of him, taking in everything. His face was unreadable, but I could tell that, despite the relief in the room, a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't have to live in fear anymore. We both knew that this was just the first chapter of what we'd have to rebuild. The community was fractured, and there were a lot of people out there who still feared the consequences of speaking up. But this moment, it was proof that change was possible, proof that you could take on the system and come out victorious. Deborah finally spoke, her voice cold and tight. "You think this changes anything? You think you've won?" I stared at her, not in anger but in quiet determination. "You've lost, you just don't know it yet." The room was still, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Deborah wasn't used to being the one on the defensive. Her face twisted, but she didn't get another word out before Harold cleared his throat, cutting her off. "The decision is made," he said firmly. "We'll be organizing a meeting to discuss the next steps for the HOA. I suggest you take some time to consider how you'll address the people you've wronged, Deborah." She didn't respond, only stood up, straightened her blazer, and walked out of the room. The door clicked behind her, and for a long moment, no one spoke. It was Lily who broke the silence. She stood up, her voice shaking but strong. I just wanted to say thank you for doing this." Her eyes flickered to Deborah's empty chair, and she let out a shaky breath. "I never thought I could speak up. I was too afraid of losing everything. But you showed me that there's more at stake than my job, there's my integrity, there's doing what's right." I gave her a nod, my throat tight with the weight of everything that had happened. She'd come through for us when it mattered most, and now the burden of her fear seemed to lift from her shoulders. She wasn't the same person who had cowered behind Deborah's threats. She was stronger now, freer. "We couldn't have done it without you, Lily," I said, my voice steady. "But this is just the beginning. The work isn't over yet." Lily nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know. I'm ready to help fix what's been broken." The rest of the meeting was a blur. People stood, shaking hands, exchanging words of relief and gratitude. The oppressive cloud that had loomed over us for so long had finally started to dissipate. But there was more to do. Deborah hadn't just controlled the HOA, she'd manipulated the entire community. It would take time to heal the damage she'd done, but I knew we were on the right path. After the meeting, I stepped outside, feeling the fresh air hit my face. Nathan joined me a moment later, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He stood silently next to me, looking out at the street, and for a long time, neither of us said anything. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but full of gratitude. "I can't believe it's over." I turned to look at him, a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "It's not over. Not yet. But this is a hell of a start." Nathan's gaze met mine, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something close to peace in his eyes. "You did it, Max. You really did it." I gave him a sharp nod, but inside, I felt a rush of pride. It wasn't just me. This had been a community effort, a team effort, and as much as I had led the charge, it was the collective will to stand up that had brought us this far. The fight wasn't over, we still had work to do, but today we had won, and that victory would echo through this community for a long time to come. The day after the meeting, the weight of everything settled in. Deborah was gone, and the community breathed a collective sigh of relief. But as much as I wanted to bask in that moment, I knew the real work was just beginning. The damage wasn't going to undo itself overnight, and the battle we'd fought was only the first step in the long road ahead. The community had been fractured by years of fear and manipulation. Some had spoken out during the meeting, but there were many more who had stayed silent, reluctant to take sides. I knew those people. Many of them were just as afraid as Lily had been. They'd been too scared of what might happen if they rocked the boat, if they stood up to someone who held so much power. But now we had a chance to rebuild, not just the HOA, but the community itself. The fear had been lifted, and people were beginning to talk. I could feel the change in the air. It was subtle, but it was there. Conversations that used to happen behind closed doors were now spilling out into the open. Neighbors were coming together, not just to talk about rules, but about how to make the neighborhood a better place for everyone. I met up with Nathan at the park later that afternoon, sitting on the old wooden bench we used to sit on when we were kids. It was a small thing, but it felt like the most important place in the world right now. The bench had been there since my grandfather's time, worn down from years of use, but still solid. I'd spent hours sitting there, thinking about my future, about the weight of the family name, and the legacy I had to live up to. Today it felt like the perfect spot to reflect on what we'd just achieved. Nathan sat beside me, his fingers idly tracing the grain of the wood. He hadn't said much all day, but I could feel his thoughts running deep, just like mine. "You know, I never thought it would come to this," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I never thought anyone would stand up to her, but you did, we did, this whole thing. It's bigger than just us." I nodded slowly. "It's about more than just taking down one person. It's about showing everyone that they don't have to be afraid anymore, that they can fight back too." Nathan glanced at me, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I know, but you've been fighting this fight for a long time, Max. I don't think I could have done it without you." I smiled back at him, a warm, genuine smile. "You didn't have to. This was always about us as a team. You know that. We've been through worse. We've got each other's backs." The words felt true. Over the years, we'd both been through our share of struggles, and today was no different. It wasn't just about confronting Deborah. It was about fighting for the things that mattered, for our families, our community, and the legacy of a place that had been built on hard work, respect, and care. But this wasn't just about personal victory. This was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless, for everyone who had watched as their lives were controlled by someone else, too afraid to speak up for fear of what would happen if they did. We'd broken that cycle. We'd proven that standing up was worth the fight. As I sat there with Nathan, I realized how much the fight had changed me. The weight of the family legacy had always felt like a burden, but now, sitting on that bench, it felt like a responsibility I could take on with pride. My grandfather's bench, a place of reflection, had become a symbol of how far we'd come and how far we still had to go. "This is just the beginning, you know," I said, turning to Nathan. "We've got a long road ahead of us, rebuilding this place, bringing people together." He nodded. "Yeah. But it feels like we're headed in the right direction now. People aren't afraid anymore." I stood up, brushing off the dust from my jeans. "We've got work to do, but we'll do it together. And we'll make sure Deborah's type never has the power to divide us again." As we walked back toward the parking lot, I felt lighter. Not just because we'd won, but because I knew that the fight wasn't over. The community needed leadership, and I was ready to step up. But more than that, the community needed unity. It needed to know that no one person could control the lives of others, not anymore. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. It was about dignity. It was about the legacy we were building, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who would come after us. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts. What do you think it takes to fight back against unfair HOA rules? Have you been in a similar situation? Comment below and let's hear your story. And don't forget to subscribe, because the battle for justice is always ongoing.